Hello, everyone. Welcome to ActInf Lab Livestream number 33.0. It's November 18th, 2021. Welcome to the ActInf Lab, everyone. We are a participatory online lab that is communicating, and mute if you're not going to be speaking, thank you. We're a participatory online lab that is communicating, learning, and practicing applied active inference. You can find us at the links here on this slide. This is a recorded and an archived live stream, so please provide us all with feedback so that we can improve our work. All backgrounds and perspectives are welcome here. We'll be following good video etiquette for live streams and respecting our awesome facilitator, Blue. At this short link, you can find the streams past and upcoming, and we are about to be heading into the second half of November 2021, where on the 23rd and the 30th, we'll have two participatory group discussions on this very paper we're going to discuss today, Thinking Like a State. And then we have yet to set the December paper. So if you know someone who might be interested in joining, or you yourself would like to discuss a paper of yours, get in touch with us. Today in ActInf Stream 33.0, the goal is to learn and discuss this paper, Thinking Like a State, Embodied Intelligence in the Deep History of Our Collective Minds by Avel, Guénin, Carlut. And the video, like all .0 videos, even though we do have the author here, it's just an introduction to some of the ideas and how to pronounce them, not a review or a final word. So we'll introduce ourselves and then go into aims and claims, abstract and roadmap, keywords, figures, and formalisms, etc. So let us know, especially if you'd like to participate in the upcoming 33.1 and 33.2. We'll start with just an introduction of saying hello and what we're excited to talk about or resolve either in the .0 or in the upcoming group discussions. And then we'll culminate with the author and transfer facilitation over. So I'm Daniel. I'm a researcher in California, and I'm just excited to check in on the progress of this important topic. People have been theorizing about societies and cities and states and everything in between since as long as they were there, probably a little bit before. So it's just a fun topic, and I'm really excited to see how active inference can give a new lens at resolving some of the long-standing questions in that area. I'll pass it to Stephen.
Yeah, thank you, Daniel. I'm Stephen. I'm based in Toronto, and I'm really interested in the multi-scale implications of state and niche construction, particularly for me, because I'm interested in working around what I call social topographies, which is probably at the scale of events and moments in people's lived experience in their architectures and places. So I'm really excited that this is bringing in this idea of state and larger scale, but also bridging that with active inference from the kind of faster, smaller scale. So yeah, lots of good stuff here. Lots of ontological questions as well, which I think is really cool. I pass it over. Should I pass it over to Blue or should I? Yep, over to you.
So I'm Blue. I'm an independent research consultant in New Mexico, and I really like this paper, and I really like working and talking with Avel about ideas, because these ideas are kind of at a bigger scale. I am interested in self-assembly of things like at the cellular and maybe even subcellular level, and this takes it to the very big level. And I think that active inference really kind of unifies this. It's a scale-free framework, and so that's kind of what I'm excited to talk about today, and maybe not resolve, but discuss and get some other perspectives on. And I'll pass it to the first author of the paper, or the only author of the paper, Avel. you'd like to just introduce yourself, say a few words.
So I'm Avel, also known as Servo. I have a training in cognitive science and physics mainly. I'm interested in philosophy and a lot of things. What's relevant here is that I funded and helped organize Kairos Research, participative citizens laboratory, which aim is to understand how to act, how to navigate contemporary social historical dynamics. And part of this is to understand why we have states and how those states that we now have are like. So the goal of the paper is to basically understand how states are constituted and what it tells about their continued structural identity through ages. And this, of course, the topic is big. There are several kind of states, but the very first thing we need to do is to understand what a state is and where it comes from. And that's what I'm trying to do there.
Awesome. So moving on to the aims and claims of the paper. So this paper, Thinking Like a State, Embodied Intelligence in the Deep History of Our Collective Mind. In the paper, it states that the core argument of this article is that states can be and should be understood as hierarchical control systems, essentially similar in their core physical architecture to brains. And we will leverage active inference to ground the study of intelligence in the way an organism maintains their structural autonomy to formally assess the collective brain hypothesis. And the big question of the article is, what kind of intelligence is displayed by city-state systems, and how is it embodied in their structure? So we'll go through the abstract. Daniel, do you want to take the first section of the abstract?
Yeah, Stephen, first.
Oh, just one comment, just because I know you mentioned Kairos there, and I've done an activity with the Kairos blanket. It's like a mapping thing where you stand on parts of Canada and to look where it came from. So I don't know if that connects. If I'm right, you Kairos is working at that kind of regional, national scale to look at questions around that. And from what I hear, that's informing how your research is being approached. Is that correct?
I did not understand the question. You spoke about Kairos blanket. Is that correct?
Oh, yeah, it's an activity. It's an activity actually not to do with the Friston blanket, literally where they put a big blanket around parts of Canada on the floor in a room, and then people have to stand on it, and they keep taking away bits which were basically which are no longer in the territories of the First Nations, and then you see how much is left, and there's not a lot left, so to speak. So it's talking to that idea of statehood and settlers and how much is left, and I wonder if that speaks to the wider work of Kairos and questions of states and how do we understand how we fit into that, or maybe I'm misunderstanding.
So that fits in the work of Kairos because it tries to bridge scales. I never heard of this Kairos blanket. This is not related to what we do in any meaningful way. But it helps embody an impression of how well settlers have appropriated indigenous American territories. So this is something that's that fits the mandate of Kairos. But the core idea of Kairos is it's the Greek notion for time. You have three in Greek, and Kairos is the instant, and it's connoted actively, like it's an instant where you can seize opportunity. And this is basically what embodied agents do. They build skills and they build capabilities and they enact them when it's appropriate. This is the goal of Kairos, to understand and reproduce this core ability. And a lot of people have used Kairos. You have anarchists that claim that are called Kairos. You have a Christian concept that is called Kairos. You have a lot of people that make the use of the concept because it's very broad and it's very it's not something that has been imported in the Christian concept of time, really, in like what we have today. So if you want to talk about this, you just use the Greek word, which is Kairos. So
Yep. Just one thought, then I'll go to the abstract, which is that Kairos as opposed to Chronos, like a chronometer with decimal time. Kairos is like timeliness, and it brings action and sort of a little bit of a moment that transcends the tick, 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 tick. So it's a cool term. I'll read the first third of the abstract. This article aims to show how the deep history of early state societies entails the development of a collective form of cognitive agency. It relates classical works in the anthropology of states, in particular Scott's Seeing Like a State, with the inactive account of biological and cognitive organization, thanks to the unified ontology for self-organization dynamics across scales offered by the active inference framework.
Stephen, do you want to take the next piece of the abstract?
Yes. Okay. So active inference conceives of cognition as synchronization across individuated sensory motor states. It entails that biological or socio-cultural constraints display a minimal form of cognition by shaping the behavior of faster dynamics in a certain way. When such constraints collectively define a basic life form, an integrated, operationally closed system, they can therefore be said to embody adaptive knowledge, properly speaking.
And then I'll just take the last part. It says, the inactive inference account I articulate here strongly motivates and methodologically grounds a holist approach in the social sciences. Indeed, it grounds the study of human societies in the role of structural constraints, whose meaning depends both on the broader system's activity and in the historical context of their emergence. The present account of the dynamics of early urbanization and state genesis aims to illustrate this approach. And a quick just walk through the roadmap of the paper. We're going to go through the introduction section, and then there are three main sections of the article. The embodied intelligence in nested minds is the first. The second is the deep history of cities and states. The third, from the urban metabolism to the collective mind. And then we'll go through the conclusion. And first up in this .0 contextualization video, we're going to discuss the keywords, which I think there were no official keywords, but these are the words that I created for the paper when discussing it at the conference. So we pulled out intelligence, autonomy, embodied intelligence, active inference, the free energy principle, the concept of thinking through other minds. And we've done that in a stream before, Daniel. Is that true? I think we have, right? And then niche construction. So I don't know. I don't have the facts on the exact number of the thinking through other minds stream, but we can find that out somewhere during this talk. We'll look it up. So Avel, do you want to maybe speak to? We'll give you the first stab at talking about what you mean by intelligence and autonomy. We've pulled a couple quotes out of the paper, but maybe you'd like to say a few words.
So, if I remember well, intelligence, etymologically, it's the capacity to make links, to connect dots of data and to build an integrated understanding of it. I don't want to commit to any specific notion of intelligence because I'm not aware of any meaningful first principle definition of it. There is a lot of work in measuring intelligence, like IQ, which maps to specific cognitive abilities and has literally zero reason to generalize to other life forms than humans. And we could argue to other life forms than humans in Occidental societies. The notion of autonomy is much more specific. It's imported to, etymologically, one's ability to build one's own rules. So, for example, if a city-state has laws and the organs that make the law are within the city-state, it is autonomous in a stricter sense. It is also recruited in the study of life and cognition and the way cognition is grounded in life by inactivist scholars, where it is related to operational closure under precarious circumstances. So it is something that is able to operate and able to recreate the conditions in which it operates, while there is no exogenous force that help him do so. For example, if you have a candle, it helps, there is a burning fire, which generates a flow of oxygen so as to maintain itself. But if someone does not keep fuel going, this dies. So this has no really way to recreate the conditions in which it operates. This is in contrast to the simplest bacteria there is, which is able to look for food, basically. So the active concept seeks to capture that.
Nice. Daniel, do you maybe want to read the quotes from the paper directly, referring to intelligence and autonomy as described?
Sure. Intelligence is the general ability for a system to understand the world, either in a reflexive propositional way or as enacted in their ecological activity. And autonomy refers to the property of operational closure under precarious circumstance, i.e. to the capability of biological systems to continuously maintain and recreate their own structural identity as a result of the collective activity of their constitutive processes.
Right, and these are processes that are actively generating and sustaining identity. And I think Avel spoke really well to operational closure in what you just described, but we just want to refer anybody who's listening to this paper by Montalville and Masio in 2015, this biological organization as a closure of constraints,
So I want to emphasize that there is, I think it's pretty old, the operational closure. It has at least 10 years, and the Montalville paper is an attempt to formalize it in logics. So it is not necessarily the reference on this. I don't remember what is the reference paper on this.
Awesome, thank you. Maybe let's move on to embodied intelligence. And Stephen, if you, this is perfect for you. If you want to read the quote from the paper describing what embodied intelligence refers to.
Yes, okay. Embodied intelligence refers to the ability for understanding adaptation, so sort of a mixture of both, that is imprinted in an agent's physical structure rather than in some general computational ability.
Very
So,
nice.
yeah, that's significant.
And then we have the wood lice. Alias, yeah, don't use the Jitsi chat, FYI. You can use Keybase if you want a back channel. But that's the wood lice example that Carl Friston provided in the 2018 example. That's a little shout out there.
Awesome. Yeah, so does anybody want to say a few more words about embodied intelligence? Maybe Avel or Stephen, or if there's something that comes up for you guys, feel free to raise your hand if there's something else you want to discuss. And the slides are the slides that we prepared, Avel, for the talk. They're in the Keybase chat as well.
So I'll mention just to say, I mean, because we're kind of introducing it at this stage, I won't start raising loads and loads of questions, and we'll save that for the next one. But and I just note that that this is useful just to highlight how this is being structured, because you've got this word intelligence and embodiment, and I know there's the talk about the brain, or the idea of the brain and the idea of the mind. So I think it's interesting here that this paper sort of bridges a bit across the brain, intelligence, mind, culture kind of area. So when it's talking here, it's kind of seems quite an open description, and is really making sure it's clear to speak to the difference to this general computational ability, and that it's somehow a different type of knowing that's being done. Maybe with the word, morphological computing sometimes is used in that world.
Nice, thank you. Maybe Daniel, do you want to explain the free energy principle and active inference?
Sure. So as on the slide here, the free energy principle states that dynamical systems given sufficiently regular boundary conditions, which are required for their continued existence, spontaneously self-organize so as to minimize their expected variational free energy through time, effectively maximizing evidence for the world model they enact. So the expected variational free energy, which we talk about in more detail elsewhere, it's kind of like all aspects of the system through time are what have to be handled in order for persistence. And using some technical formalisms, that turns out to have equivalence with evidence for a generative model where one is persisting. Active inference explicitly brings action into that inference process, and it's the process by which dynamical systems maximize their evidence for the model of the world which they enact. This can occur by a system altering its environment to fit expectations, i.e. niche modification. So it's the difference between the free energy principle merely saying that persistent systems are going to be isomorphic with those that have high evidence for the world model which they enact. And then active inference as a corollary process theory says, and the way that they're going to do that is through inference, updating their internal model, or through action, which can be just sort of like a flock of birds, action in the sky, or it can be niche modification like stigmergy.
Nice, thank you. And then we can go on to thinking. Oh, Stephen, you have a comment to say?
Yeah, just one piece here also sort of flags up for me is the use of the word model, because we talk about their own model of the world, and yet often we think of models as something that we've created in the world, you know, on a piece of paper and things like that. So again, there's a sort of ontological challenge in the sense that it is kind of like a self model, but it's a self model that's not a representation. But our language is kind of couched in our history. So anyway, I think that might be something that sort of resurfaces and have to kind of keep restating, because people might have this representational kind of inbuilt way of, you know, those metaphors are quite embedded. So it's hard for people to necessarily switch to what it means to move away from representational approaches.
I have one question as well. The reason why we're talking about active inference and free energy principle in this paper. So, Avel, what does ActInf do for this paper? Are there other contender theories in the game? How else are people trying to take a unified approach to studying the specifics and the generalities of states?
So the approach I have, I define as an active inference with the N between parentheses. It's a synthesis between what is said by an activist and what is said by active inference theorists. The core framework is enactive. I'm interested in characterizing state societies as a network of constraints. So as slow processes that are exist at a holistic scale, not within individual, not between individual, but in some sense over individual, and that shapes the activity of individuals so as to maintain itself. That's the core argument. Society is our organism. But now, if I want to get there, I need some strong instances. If I need to get there, if I need to formalize the role of states, which are at core information processing machines in it, I need to formalize in a stronger sense the relation between basic synchronization, basic self-organization, and epistemic states. And that is precisely what active inference does. So I need the two. I need enactive formalism, the enactive approach, and I need active inference formalism to make the link between the ecological activity of states as an inferential process and the body, the constraints that actually consist that actually state societies consist in.
Nice, thank you. We can, I guess, move on to thinking through other minds. Stephen, did you have a comment?
Just one other comment. I was interested by the, you're using the term constraints. So and in active inference, it's sometimes thought of as the higher level processes are in some ways constraining the behavior of lower level processes rather than necessarily dictating them. So that, it's a little like I'm doing the faster jig and someone's just slowing me down a little bit, and so on. So yeah, just curious that word constraints is brought in, because often people think of intelligence as all about doing things and not constraining things. So anyway, just curious about that.
Yep, that's related to synergetics, Hakan, not Bucky, and about like a wave and a ripple. Like the wave constrains where the ripple can go. The faster fluctuations are constrained by the slower ordering parameters. So here we have thinking through other minds, and this is another body of work which we won't spend a ton of time on, but for organisms that are making generative models of their niche, sometimes that niche contains other organisms such as their self, and it matters how those other organisms also include generative models of oneself. So thinking through other minds is describing how in a shared epistemic niche, a shared informational niche with shared salience cues, for example, that two different agents are able to coordinate because they are thinking through each other's minds. Like if I put up my hand, then Blue will think that I want to speak. So it's sort of like a little bit of a theory of mind, but with more of a ActInf flavor.
So both like the idea of constraint and this concept of thinking through other minds bring me back to Mike Levin's paper, The Computational Boundary of a Self, because of the nested like cognitive cones, right? And when he kind of talked about it, he talked about, the higher order or like the larger level, the higher level organism or collective constrains the behavior of like the individual like sub-level collectives. So that was kind of this idea of constraint. And then also like thinking through other minds, like specifically we talked about how connections between cells, individuals, but connections that essentially breed information sharing. So when you have like a shared informational niche, that enables this process kind of thinking through other minds where you think more as a collective. And so that expands the cognitive boundary of the self to then include other, individuals within that cognitive boundary. Stephen?
Yeah, and that ties into the work of Andy Clark and the extended mind. So there's a so the way that gets there's a bit of talk about how do you think about that extension happening and how much is it an extension of the individual and how much, I suppose, is what's being talked about here is how much does what has been extended start to become its own sort of cognitive agent. So
nice. And maybe very appropriately, Avel has returned and we are moving on to talk about niche construction. And I think Avel might have a lot to say about the niche and its role in extending the cognitive boundary. So maybe do you want to give us a few insights into, can we help us think through your mind?
Modify the audiovisual
I'm not sure what I could say about the niche. Sorry?
Modify the audio-visual niche of our joint attention.
I'm not sure I will modify the niche. I will convert information within the niche. I don't know. Anyway, I can change the model of the niche. This is not what I'm going to do. I think I'm not trying to do that actively, at least. Whatever. So there is a body of work in biology, evolutionary biology, which is centered on how organisms modify their direct environment in a way that somehow fits their ecological needs. So a typical example is how beavers will build a dam so as to get, I honestly don't know what beavers get out of a dam, but they get something. And the basic argument in the thinking through other minds framework is that the way you modify a niche has a cognitive value. It's externalized expectations. And by externalizing expectations, it allows expectations to synchronize between individuals. And it's there is a very clear analogy or identity between once you accept there is a cognitive value in a niche construction as the externalization of expectations, there is a very clear analogy and even identity between niche construction and extended cognitions. Beaver are just extending their cognition, their expectations, the domain of the world that somehow participates to the fact that they live, they keep on living and understanding the world. So there is a pretty basic way in which an organism can expand the extent of the world, the domain which is operationally closed and which participates actively in their maintenance. And this is basically what there is to be found in niche construction. By shaping their niche, an organism shapes their world, they shape their cognition, they shape their body. And I'm not sure, I'm trying to give a general insight in niche construction and how it relates, but I'm not sure how relevant it is because I'm not sure what is the point that is to be made followingly.
Daniel?
Just that niche construction is an important mechanism of extended cognition, like the recent stigmergy models show, that individuals don't need to carry on board or internally the entire cognitive apparatus. They only need to know how to interact and potentially modify a niche. And then also, I think this is important when we're talking about cities and so on and states, because our niche can, as per thinking through other minds, include others like us or distant from us, but also it includes the abiotic niche. So climate change and resource utilization, those are niche modifications. There are some radioactive mountains that have been niche modified. And so it provides a continuity between the kinds of ecological changes that humans make with the cognitive approach to ecosystems. And so that's why it's a very rich framework to build off of.
So I just want to read this quote from the paper really quick, and then Stephen will come to your comment. So it says, as stated previously, the network of constraints defining the structural identity of basic life needs not be printed in flesh. It only needs to influence faster processes so as to continually recreate itself. And the references for this are there on the slides if you care to probe further. It says, such constraints can be embedded in the informationally rich sociocultural niche, which enable the human ecology by affording adaptive coordination and the development of complex skills. And I think one of the main things that this paper does, and Avel, feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, but it kind of takes the idea of cumulative cultural evolution and brings the niche into this as a cognitive extension. So I think that's one of the key moves made here.
Basically, I know cultural evolution. I have known cultural evolution for like 5 years or so, ActInF for 1 year only. So cultural evolution shapes how I see things. And I'm currently writing a paper on that could be interpreted on reductionism in cultural evolution. And the fact is, cumulative cultural evolution in cultural evolution is the replacement of low fitness variants by high fitness variants. Within variants, I mean, of cultural tokens that are implemented within minds or behavior, because there is not a strong ontology on what the replicator is in cultural evolution. And a basic insight I want to convey is that culture does not stop in the brain. Culture certainly does not stop in individuated cultural tokens. And one of the goals of the paper is to show that social cultural evolution, it has a knowledge extension or intention, I don't know. It exists not only within the minds of individual and within the behavioral effects of cultural tokens, it exists in structures that are not apprehensible by an individual and that are not entailed by any specific cultural token. Hence the holism.
Nice, thank you. Stephen?
Yeah, also bringing that beaver example is, to some extent, a beaver constructs a dam, and to some extent, maybe it grows a dam. Maybe in the same, so by adding pieces, it's growing something a bit. And at what point does it stand back and say, oh, move that one a bit to the left, move that a little bit to the right, and sort of improve the construction, and how much is it an evolving process? And I suppose there's also that idea that once something has grown and it's changed the niche, something else, just like the brain effectively has to grow before it can do its thinking. So maybe there's something about how these structures have grown and been constructed. So I don't know. I'm just mentioning that.
Awesome, thank you. I guess maybe we kind of got ahead of ourselves talking about niche modification and cultural evolution. I love this picture because it really shows kind of how much we have offloaded our cognitive selves into the niche environment. Like, we don't need to know how to use directions or what restaurants are good, or we don't need to know actually any of that anymore, because it's all like riding around with us in a smartphone in our pocket all the time. So we've just put our brain, we've offloaded all of the cognitive capacity of our brain, or at least a good portion of it. So what do we think about now? It makes me think about that always. It says in the paper, we claim that niche modification is critical for cumulative cultural evolution, and advancements such as writing allow active inference to occur between agents and stigmergic cues embedded in the niche. Avel?
Did I write what you just said? Okay. What I wanted to note is that what you described, the way we offload information on our social and environmental and technological environment, is the classical collective brain picture, which is entailed by mostly Boyd, Richardson, and Henrich modeling of cumulative cultural evolution. What I want to show is that to go a step beyond, we do not only have a self that is augmented by environmental cues. There is a self outside ourselves. There is things that shape social life and that are not. There are agency that shape social life, and that is not human, that is institutional. So that's the step beyond the collective brain, the vanilla collective brain view, which is maybe an anti-collective brain. There is actually such a thing as a collective brain. It's not an image, and we can study it.
Well, we can study it now through Wikipedia and the internet, like our network of the collective brain. Stephen?
Yeah, it's interesting as well in terms of, we have all this extended information, but there's a very good book called The Paradox of Choice. So the thing is, we have all this information, but you still have to do an action policy on what to do. And the challenge is, you can have so many, it's like going to the supermarket and, you can buy 50 different types of olive oil. It's just olive oil at the end of the day, but now you've got to choose between 50, and you've got, so there's a sense of abundance, but there's also a need for an action policy, which is of course what active inference talks about, that ultimately it's not the volume of information that's going to be the game, it's the ability to act and in appropriate ways, and make sense of how to be in your niche. So that's kind of interesting.
Awesome, thank you. So we are going to move on. We're going to go into the next section, Embodied Intelligence in Nested Minds. But just to quickly summarize here, like what was the brought up in the introduction. So we've gone through the keywords, but just to clearly just state it out, autonomous systems are defined by a set of processes that create and sustain their identity. They embody their understanding and adaptive abilities within their physical structure. They enact a model of their world and seek to maximize evidence for this model through active inference, and they can maximize model evidence through modification of their niche. So just to kind of sum up what an autonomous system is and where we are at this point. And then we'll move on to discussing embodied intelligence in nested minds. So a quote from the paper, it says, here we argue that innovations are instead an emergent property of our species' cultural learning abilities, applied within our societies and social networks. Our societies and social networks act as collective brains. We outline how many human brains, which evolved primarily for the acquisition of culture, together beget a collective brain. Oh, this isn't actually from the Thinking Like a State paper. This is from the Innovation in the Collective Brain paper. And this framework, this collective brain framework, grounds the study of intelligence in the way that an organism maintains structural autonomy and allows the formal assessment of the collective brain hypothesis. So the collective brain hypothesis has been put forward, but not formally assessed up until this point. Avel, do you want to talk a little bit more about that? Because I probably just botched it.
About how the collective brain hypothesis is not formally assessed?
Yeah.
So in cultural evolution, you have what I'd say is the dominant theory is gen cultural coevolution theory, which is basically centered on how we have cultural variants that have an adaptive role, and there are a set of cognitive bias or cognitive mechanism, but actually cognitive bias, behavioral bias, actually, that help us identify what are the most adaptive cultural variants. And this has a feedback effect on gene selection, which has feedback effect on cultural selection. And basically, all of human adaptation is entailed by a process of a coevolutionary process between genetic and cultural evolutionary information processes. And the fact is, there are numerous claims in the literature that there is some sort of collective computation that is entailed, or collective cognition that is entailed by this. So there is, if I remember well, Heinrich and Muthukrishna, who wrote the Innovation in the Collective Brain paper, and there is, I think, Boyd and Smaldino. Boyd, which is basically one of the two founders of the initial formalism, and Smaldino, which is one of the most computationally savvy, a member of the current literature, that wrote a paper on collective cognition. No, distributed computation, cultural evolution as distributed computation. I don't remember the exact title, but it's. I want to accentuate it about its words. Like they have a model of individual bias in selection, and they have a narrative interpretation of this somehow entailing some kind of computation, and there is nothing in between. There is a few papers of less central actors that kind of are interested in the coevolution of social networks and cultural variants, Axel and Smola, to name them. There is literally not one paper that explains how is this supposed to be cognition, what are the mechanisms, what is the cognitive architecture. There is nothing on it. Or it's marginal, and I did not heard of it. And the goal of the paper is to basically explain how we can ground a view of cognitive mechanisms that are entailed by the social cultural networks and social cultural constraints that are embedded within a society. And it's not a model, because to build a full causal model of any brain or organism is not tractable, but it's to prove that it's meaningful. It's there is a positive way in which we can model societies as, or at least process within societies as, a collective form of cognition. And a key example of this is the state, because we have access to the mechanisms, we have access to different papers with which they understand and predict and control reality.
Awesome. That's a perfect, I think, transition into the next slide. Do you want to read this for us, Daniel?
This paper uses the framework described to illustrate that the coevolution of top-down control and cultural niche construction enabled the emergence of the city-state complex and how these collective organizations maintain structural autonomy.
Awesome, thank you. And so that's kind of the summary, I say, of the section, the Embodied Intelligence in Nested Minds section. Does anybody want to give a thought, or we can go on to the next section?
Just what you just said about how we know the mechanism, Avel, of the state. I'm thinking we see its neurotransmitters and its action selection policies. So it's like every system has advantages and disadvantages for its study. This is one where many of the key features are designed. And so it's a lot more like investigating the connections of a program that was written rather than the potentially like map territory debates over like, well, what is the bacteria really doing? Are we really measuring the bacteria? But it's like, we know how certain processes in the state happen, but not all of them. And citizens usually don't know.
Stephen?
Yeah, sort of following on to what Daniel said, a quick question in a way is how much you maybe trying to have a sort of a realist approach on the idea of the brain, or it being a brain, or how much is it an instrumental tool or a metaphor? So I'd be curious, as you know, you take that correlation, because you've got brain, you've got mind, you've got intelligence, you've got extended cognition. Is it that you are really wanting to make it say that it is like a brain that's kind of enacting its own action policies, or so that might be helpful.
So I think actually, like, maybe we should hold that to the end section from the because I think we're going to get more into how is a city like a brain as we get closer to the end of this contextualization.
We'll save it for dot 1 and dot 2 because we'll cover just the background here, but it's a very good question.
Yeah, so, very good. It's going to provoke a lot of discussion, so that's why I'm like, well, maybe we should get through the rest of the talk going on first. So so we're moving on now to the deep history of cities and states. Here is another quote from the paper. Stephen, do you want to read this for us?
Yes. Okay. Cultural niche construction allowed humans to alter their socio-cognitive ecology in a way that allowed extensive functional specialization and the evolution of supra-individual agency through mediating institutions.
That makes me think about the evolution of functional specialization in ant colonies. And it's like, you can't have the super specialized task. You know, you can't have somebody who specializes on just sourdough bread until there's somebody else who can help them with some other tasks. And that's the economic inspiration for why they call that process in ants division of labor, downstream of Adam Smith, 1776, the economic division of labor, and the candle maker and the shoemaker and all of that. So once you have a lot of people living together, they can specialize in a new way. There are new institutions needed to mediate, and that results in more being different.
I love how Daniel like says ants and gets like giddy and excited. Stephen?
Yeah, and I noticed this term supra-individual. So there's kind of this, I suppose in the ant colony, you think of the queen, but in our world, we have these. And actually, I've been thinking about a lot of this myself in terms of how we relate to these bigger scales. So this idea of a supra-individual or supra-collective ties into the idea of the state, you know, because, you know, we think of you know, the word state is actually used literally in the United States to be, you know, a region, but there is an idea that it's trying to maintain something. So that term, I think, is a useful one to sort of pull out, and it's super individual agency. So that ties it into active inference in an interesting way. It would be interesting to know the term socio-cognitive ecology. It's not one I've heard before in quite that way. So I don't know if that could be something just to maybe ground that term in this context.
Cool, we can return to it. And I added the book cover for Leviathan with the person made up of other people.
Awesome. Thank you. In this section of the paper, Avel explains how state niche construction depended on serial monoculture, the technology of writing, material infrastructure, dense settlements, and engineering societies from the top down, as documented in Seeing Like a State by Scott. Avel, do you have a few maybe words to say about this? I mean, more than the brief kind of overview I just gave.
So I'm not sure I identified a key subject, like on the importance on the morphogenesis of states from a social scientific perspective.
We're just talking about state niche construction. Like, what did that depend on?
All of those things. Basically, a state is, I think we could have a lot of definitions. Durkheim says it, I think it's Durkheim. It is said in certain senses that it is essentially a monopoly on legitimate violence. So if there is a group of men that has weapons and that has the exclusive right to use it, and that this right is broadly accepted, it is a state. I'm mostly interested in the mode of operation of a state. So for me, it's a chain of command, basically. It's an emissive systems that makes people do things. So those two definitions, they entail the loss of human autonomy. They entail that you have at least a subset of humans that are constrained to follow the laws that are extrinsically imposed. So that's in clear deviation from what is done, say, in Iroquois society, where, at least by the partial accounts I have, mostly no one has the power to coerce anyone else, and any decision is grounded on rational debate. So this is not what a state is like. A state is when you have a guy with the biggest bird, and he can say, okay, you go kill this person because I want to. I want this weapon. And you have definition of the states that you have definition of the state that is grounded in the sovereign. I'm not sure when it initiates. I think it's with Leviathan, which I did not read. But it's basically that the state is a central actor that has power on anyone, which is, sorry, I have chat things. So state is something that has power on anyone, and it's not tied to a specific individual. So that entails the capability for for institution or a set of individuals to basically coerce other people to do things. And this entail, for example, at least enough centralization of resources for other people to not flee, or enough imbalance in wealth for other people to get to you, even though they know it will strip them of their autonomy. So it's a basic grounding on which the literature, the anthropologic literature on states and state emergence is written. And this entails agriculture, trade, a lot of ways for basically wealth to be centralized and powerful people to be able to constrain everyone else.
Awesome. And that speaks very well to how states get a grip on their subjects and themselves, and what is the common grounding maybe that is used to get a heterogeneous understanding of states. Oh, sorry, emergency alert.
Your attention, please. Your attention, please. Update in action policy requested from the state.
Exactly. So now states get a grip on us through like our cognitive offloading into the niche, right? Stephen, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I mean, this also speaks to that challenge of being able to get a grip on things which are beyond the adjacent scale. Like they're trying to get, they have these technologies that can reach out to everyone, but at the same time, it's kind of, they can't easily get a grip. So there's some interesting points there around, because there's a few scales between us and the state, right? And that's interesting.
And technological development, like little tiny chips that track where you move, that makes it a little easier to get a grip on where somebody is moving. So it's a coevolution with the states and technology, going back to agriculture and writing and ledgers, and now we're in a new phase of ledgers from 0, 1, 2, 3.
Nice. Stephen?
Yeah, and of course the challenge is that they get a grip on what you're doing, but their inference is about why you're doing it, decontextualized. So they think someone's doing X or Y, and that may be wildly different to, they may be underestimating the risk, or they may be radically overestimating the risk of behavior.
Awesome. So I'm going to just flip through these next few slides. So dense settlements, what the function of the dense settlement did was allowed for economic codependency. And we talked earlier about the functional specialization that was necessary for this economic codependency. And it also facilitated the development of nested social communities. And Daniel wrote, is there a scaling relationship here? And I think we have to wait and address that maybe in the dot one. And moving on, it says, enforcing state control over urban systems mandates building acceptance into the population. And this is like, how do you let the state be in charge of you? How do you grant grip to the state? And this is, the people must perceive competency in the authoritarian regime. And there's a redistribution of wealth, like, for example, paying taxes. And also symbolic legitimacy, which is achieved through the church, largely, or maybe there's other ways, but was in the early development of cities and states largely religious based. So there's a lot of things that we've talked about, so that tie into formation of cities and states, and it's large scale coordination, collective identity. Crop redistribution, which I thought was interesting. Like, some people grow it, some people eat it, some people take it, some people sell it. And then the functional specialization, specialized roles, and the control of the money and the flow of the money. So all these things together unify to give a state grip and allow this kind of top-down control. Is there any comments on that? Or if not, we can move on to the next section.
Just that if those are the necessary and sufficient features when there's a crisis of competency or distribution of wealth or symbolic legitimacy, what does that forebode?
Avel, do you have an answer? I'm sure, waiting in the wings.
Yes, the answer is basically a structural demographic theory, which is a central, say, result in cryptodynamics. Which basically states afford the possibility for the elite to ignore the social maintenance and just capture wealth. And when they do too much, it causes political instabilities. So, and this entail fluctuating cycles of integration and disintegration in state developments. And by the way, we in the sense of France, the US, and likely global capitalism, are in a phase of disintegration, which entails that we have urgent need to understand how to organize outside or in spite of dominant institution, and to understand where they come from.
Cool. So we're going to move into the last section of the paper, which is from the urban metabolism to the collective mind. And we're going to go back to the main question of the article, which was, what kind of intelligence is displayed by city-state systems, and how is it embodied within their structure? And maybe, Stephen, do you want to read this quote from the paper?
Yes. Okay, so answering this question in terms of inactive inference entails revisiting our account of the urbanization dynamics as the result of city-state systems actively managing to get a grip on their world, i.e. minimize their expected variational free energy.
Cool. And there are a couple more quotes from this section that we can move on to. Daniel, do you want to read this first one here?
Basic autonomy is indeed formally defined as operational closure, or more precisely, the capability of a network of constraints to canalize faster processes, like metabolic flows, into maintaining and recreating itself. I like that. It's kind of a twist on the Kantian organism concept, the teleological definition. The organism is like the level it makes sense at, and this takes a more operational and mechanistic approach towards closure of mechanism and constraints and autopoiesis, rather than merely end-directedness, which doesn't immediately suggest a mechanism. And then, since the material and socio-cultural landscapes of urban systems canalize human activities so as to maintain itself, the process of urbanization clearly entails the constitution of cities as basic life. Food comes in, waste goes out, city's alive.
Awesome. And I love this picture of like the elephant is the city. Serval, did you want to say something?
Also to point out that the first point you made is that the Montavel and Monsieur definition, or my account of them, is a twist on the Kantian idea that organism is the level at which it makes sense. And it's basically the movement that Montavel and Monsieur and Moreno make, because in activism, at first, it's grounded in continental philosophy, in phenomenology. This is the grounding in which Varela and maybe Maturana, I'm not sure, articulated the view that cognition is in fact grounded in life. And what mostly people and the Basque Center for Life Sciences, I think it's called, try to do is to mechanize it, to operationalize it, to ground it into specific biochemical processes. So it's you precisely captured what this account is meant to do.
Awesome. And good job inferring, Daniel. based on the stigmergic cues left in the niche. And we can move on to a couple more quotes from the paper. This is one that really resonated with me, and it's paraphrasing Jablonka and Lamb in 2006, this paper that's here, The Evolution of Information in the Major Transitions. It says, a full-fledged evolutionary transition typically entails the emergence of new forms of information systems, mediating regulation at the collective level and or the heritability of collective traits. And then another quote from the paper is also taken from this Gowdy and Krall paper in 2014. It says, the emergence of city-states with their professional classes and their mediating institutions based on writing technologies constitute a clear case of such a transition, especially in the case of the late agricultural civilizations. And I totally get this, and also it really speaks to how stigmergic cues left in the niche environment can contribute to the formation of our collective brain. I mean, writing, like, we can leave stigmergic cues for generations yet to follow. And some writing in stone, right? Like, so this is like, still we can read it. many ages and generations later, which I thought that was really poignant. Stephen?
Yeah, one thing I'd be interested in terms of the state is how much different areas of society or the state are trying to achieve similar types of outcome. So when there's we've just had that case of that video of Cortez being murdered, and so like within the state you have internal conflicts, within the state itself, but also how much does the people at different scales have to be aligned, or how much will the state itself kind of do what states do, so to speak, as its own mind?
Awesome. Thanks. Daniel?
Yeah, I agree about not every single action in the state necessarily being the same. Like if you looked at the body, you said, well, no, we're supposed to be making glucose. Why are there cells that are breaking it down? Or like there can be sections that are doing processes that seem directly opposite to each other, but that can be part of a broader regulatory process. So it brings into question, what are the official processes versus the things that are in the gray zone of the state? And how do we go from this model into more useful forms?
Nice. Thanks. And so we can move now to another quote from the paper that is from paraphrasing this paper that we actually just did in a recent live stream, How to Count Biological Minds by Matthew Sims. And in the Thinking Like a State paper, it says, if the nested hierarchy of regulation systems enables adaptive behavior at the system scale, it effectively enacts a collective mind, regardless of whether system components retain their cognitive ability. And this speaks back to what we were saying earlier about the top level kind of constraining the lower levels. Like maybe there's like once you contribute to the collective, then you've contributed to something greater than yourself, and your own cognitive ability perhaps doesn't matter so much. Any thoughts on that, or we can move on to some more topics from the paper? Daniel, do you want to read this quote?
The closest analogue of our intuitive picture of a mind in urban systems is their most disembodied mechanism for adaptive regulation, administration. Indeed, just like neuronal cognition, it entails the top-down regulation by a specialized population with the help of a specific purpose information system. Makes me think about those tubes that they used to put the physical packages in and send them, and now there's special information channels, but you better be listening when that channel calls.
So that's like Futurama, like they have the bureaucracy, like the administration. And administration, I love this quote from the paper. I do think like administration is totally like disembodied from like reality, and bureaucracy is like so imposing. But like in the Futurama, they all have like, it's like space age modern transmission. Like you could just click DocuSign on the internet, and like yet they're using like tubes literally like to send the things off. And it takes 7 years to get approval or something ridiculous like that. But it does work like that, right? Bureaucracy is kind of crazy. This next quote says, the institution of state-sponsored legal codes affords a way to directly transcribe administrative expectations into individual minds. Rule of law is therefore a core tool by which states create their world through building the basis of their own intelligent behavior into their socio-cultural niche. And this is brilliant, right? Like just yesterday, my landlord called the codes officer because my neighbors have weeds, right? Like I know they're not allowed to have weeds. It's beyond the expectation of like, our neighborhood that nobody has weeds. And everyone knows that this is the expectation. Some people don't maintain their weeds, and we all have the right and duty and obligation to, impose that on our niche environment. Daniel?
So the expectations, the normative expectations, a lot of laws are like, it shall be within 2 weeks after this, giving notice that this happens. So they're expectations. and then they're called codes. And so it made me think about predictive coding. And it's like, we can predict that this technology is going to be used this way. So I know it's not exactly what people mean with the neural rate codes, etc., with predictive processing, predictive coding, but laws are normative. They're saying what should happen, and that helps behave as expected. You want to be on the right side of the road driving in the US. So that's like an expectation, and then it becomes an intersubjective preference that is sponsored by the state. So it just kind of cool, again, showing points of contact between people's day-to-day life and their intuitive explanations for how these systems work. And then it's like, yes, we have an ontology that picks up right with you and then goes a little further than you might have expected too.
Awesome. Serval?
Yes, that's exactly the idea. Laws entail the externalization of expectations. The fact that they are normative is, I think, accidental. It's epiphenomenal to their core role, which is to shape behavior. You have a project in legal studies, I don't know what you call that, which is called, I think, Homo juridicus or Homo legalis, or some closely associated formulation, which has a behavioral approach to law. And we need to do that more.
Yeah, sounds good. So we just have some summary quotes maybe from the paper and to kind of summarize the ideas that were presented here. Daniel, do you want to read one or some of these?
Okay, I'm just picking which one I would want to read. I think the second one is a lot like what we were just talking about with the state defining expectations and then modifying its own niche, that operational closure, to implement those expectations lest it dissolve. Then I like this top quote: "Our notion of intelligence is based upon active inference, a scale-free framework applying to any system with individuated boundary states." And then it's like, even the word state is a pun, as Avel pointed out before, état being state in French, and we talk about internal, external blanket states, boundary states. That sounds like it's going to be at the boundary of the empire. And then this is what it looks like to apply active inference to a real system, to go from a sort of Bayesian graph boundary notion to being like, well, what if that boundary state country was intermediating and insulating between these other two? So I like how even the word state comes into play.
I like that. I really like that too, and I like that that's kind of a play on like the Friston particular physics, like specific particular physics, but also like physics as related to a particle. And the idea of a state, actually something when I was proofreading this paper was like, I know that you're talking about like city states, but it's not immediately obvious to the reader that like you might want to say like city states to kind of flesh that out like from the get-go, because it can be such a play on word, right? It's a boundary state, it's a blanket state, it's an active state, it's a city state. Daniel?
Maybe one other thing we can talk about in the dot 1 and 2 is states as we know them are new. And so it's only been a few generations. Like your great-great-great-grandparents, that's a long time ago. It's a lot of tacos ago, but it's a blink of the eye in terms of evolution and in terms of deep history. And so even pre-Westphalia, that was not so long ago. And there's so many world traditions. And so just realizing that we're in a very non-stationary moment with the development and the implementation of states, it's really important, because it can be easy to be like, oh, it's a grind, all the states in the UN and, 50 states in the US. It's like, even 70 years ago, there weren't that many states in the US and there was different countries in the world. So things are changing. It just sometimes it's at a different time scale, which makes sense because they're bigger and slower entities than we are. Serval?
I want to point out two things. First, the pun is not intended, but no, I will claim it is, and no one will check. The second is that the received view is that states emerge with agriculture. It is what Gordy and Kroll said in the paper I cited. It is not accurate, or we don't know whether it's accurate. You have a pretty good Singh review of the literature of the state emergence, and the fact is, we do not know what human states were like before written history. We do not know. Most importantly, it's something Greber and Wengrow, two leading anthropologists in historical anthropology, like to rave about. There are kinds of organizations that are authoritarian. There are kinds of organizations that are not. So even if we are signs of, I don't know, great ritual states or anything, we don't know whether those kind of organizations were like what we know today, because Western nation states are extreme in kind of extractive and coercive behavior. They are shaped by war within Europe and between Europe and colonialized countries. So I much prefer to ground the history in which I talk in European history, in modern history, after Westphalia, after the birth, or in the roots of the birth of the nation states, because it's pretty hard to talk about the roots of Sumerian states. We need to do so because those are states. We need to do so if we want to talk about what states are. But if you want to talk about what our states are, we need to go in Westphalia. We need not to go in Sumer or Egypt or whatever.
So just to kind of play off of that extractive and corrosive behavior, and that states are often born out of war, something that you mention in the paper, but I don't think maybe gets enough attention, is the concept of shared identity. Because in this shared identity, like, that's what makes us faction off into our own state. We're going to divide and become something new. And Daniel was saying how we have so many states now, so many more states than we've ever had before. And this like factionalism, and we all have like this distinct identity. Is this going to breed more war? Or is every state going to become so small because they'll just faction and keep dividing? I mean, you can get something, the most homogenous human culture you can imagine, and they will find something to divide them. So is this good? Is it bad? If we keep dividing, is it going to be like a homogenous like bunch of sub factions, or is it just going to lead to like more division and more war?
If I discuss that, it will take a lot of time. I understood this session was
Next time.
Yeah.
And we are much off track.
Definitely.
So let's talk about this after.
We'll save it for the dot one. Okay, so moving on. The collective mind does not directly emerge from inter-individual interactions, but from slower evolving dynamical constraints which supervene on but do not reduce to human activity. Therefore, the proper scale of analysis of collective cognition is an integrated activity of entire urban systems, and should more specifically be grounded in the broader processes by which they maintain and reproduce their structural identity, understood as an operationally closed set of constraints underlying their metabolic, cognitive, and ecological activity.
Replace urban with brain body. You could say the same exact thing. The brain and the body have to be an integrated unit. Finally, Blue, what does it mean to think like a state? I'm going to put your overlay over the video so it'll look like you're a state. Go for it.
The cognitive activity of states is defined mechanically by the standardized administrative systems they use to understand and manipulate their world, and functionally by their drive to build and enact grip over the material and sociocultural niche. So there it is. The question, the answer. We made it through from A to Z.
And I like, it's not what is it like to be a state. It's not the Nagel 54. What is it like to be a bat? This is more of a cognitivist interpretation that helps us actually potentially find useful ways. Like, I don't want to do in X country, you grip the state. People can kind of write their own jokes on that theme.
Nice. And we can just think about what maybe these questions lead to, maybe what a good understanding of this work might enable. Avel mentioned earlier the necessity for this understanding because of the kind of divided space that we're in right now. What are the next steps for the FEP and active inference? What are the goals? What are you still curious about? If you want to participate in either of the discussion videos, get in touch with us. We would love to have you on to talk about these ideas in more detail. Do you guys have any closing thoughts?
Yeah, just in .1, let's dive in and open some threads, take some notes. In .2, let's see where we go. Maybe somebody would like to pick up on one of those threads or apply one of these ideas and say, oh, I was working on a history of my region, and so I want to see how I can apply that. So we applied active inference to get thinking like a state, and then how do we apply thinking like a state for something else, whatever it is that somebody is interested in seeing.
Avel, thank you for coming and kind of guiding us through our contextualization video. It's always a pleasure. Do you want to have the final word?
I don't have anything smart to say, so yes, but these are the words.
The paper does speak for itself quite brilliantly, I will say.
Cool.
All right.
Authors who come on .0 are the best. No, it's all good. Thanks for joining, Blue, and facilitating. See you later, Serval, and thanks also to Stephen. So hope to see you all in the .1 or the .2 or beyond. So bye.
Bye.